When you picture early Christianity, you probably think of a tight-knit group of apostles, all on the same page, spreading one unified message. But what if that whole picture is wrong? What if, right at the very heart of it, there was a massive hidden conflict between two of its biggest names? We're about to dive into a pretty controversial theory from the work of Robert Eisenman that doesn't just challenge what we think we know. It completely flips the script on the origins of Christianity. So the story we usually get is that James, the brother of Jesus, and the Apostle Paul were, well, allies, working for the same team, right? But this theory poses a really radical question. Were they actually arch rivals? Were they leading two completely different movements that were locked in a battle for the very soul of this new faith? All right, so to really get our heads around this, we're going to walk through four key parts. First, we'll look at the fundamental clash itself. Then we'll profile James and Paul as this theory sees them. After that, we'll dig into their biggest disagreements. And finally, we'll get to the most explosive idea of all, that the history we read today might have been deliberately rewritten. So, let's start with the central idea. According to this theory, what was going on between James and Paul wasn't just some minor squabble over rules. Nope, this was a deep, foundational conflict. It was a battle between two totally competing visions for what this new religion was even supposed to be. See, Eisenman's argument is that we're not looking at one movement with a few internal debates. He's saying these were two entirely separate movements that just happened to share an origin story. You had the original community in Jerusalem, led by James, and then you had this completely different thing being built by Paul, and it was designed for a totally different audience. So who were these two men at the heart of it all? Let's put them side by side, because the way this theory portrays them, they couldn't be more different. They're total opposites. And the contrast is just stark. On one side, you have James, called the Just. He's the leader in Jerusalem, totally rooted in Jewish law. The theory calls him an ultra-legal pietist, basically someone who is incredibly devoted to following religious law to the letter. His movement is presented as the one true continuation of Judaism. And then there's Paul. He's the Hellenized innovator, reaching out to non-Jews, the Gentiles. And this is a big one. The theory claims he was compromised by Rome and that he created something entirely new, which Eisenman calls a Pauline Christ cult. And that word Hellenized is absolutely key here. It just means taking a religion and mixing it with Greek culture and philosophy. The argument is that Paul did this on purpose to make his message more appealing to the wider Roman world, but in the process, he basically stripped it of its original Jewish soul. Okay, so we've met our two main characters. Now, what exactly were they fighting about? What was the actual battleground for their beliefs? Well, according to Eisenman's thesis, they clashed on three huge critical issues. And wow, the divide was deep. Let's break it down. First, Gentile converts. James's side said they absolutely had to follow Jewish law. Paul's side, no law required. Then, theology, the very nature of Jesus. For James's group, Jesus was a human, a messianic revolutionary. For Paul, he was a supernatural God-man. And maybe the most critical difference? Politics. James was leading what was essentially a Jewish resistance movement against Rome. Paul, on the other hand, was all about pro-Roman accommodation. They were polar opposites. And this leads to a really heavy accusation. Paul is called a pro-Roman quisling. Now, a quisling is a traitor who collaborates with an enemy occupation. So the argument here is that Paul's entire theology was just a form of cultural surrender. It was designed to water down the movement's revolutionary political message to make it harmless and acceptable to the Roman Empire. Okay, so all of this brings us to the most provocative, most explosive part of this whole theory. The idea that the historical record we all rely on, the New Testament itself, was deliberately changed. The core of this argument is a really radical claim that the New Testament isn't objective history. It's more like propaganda, written by the winners of this conflict. Eisenman suggests that these books were intentionally crafted to make Paul's version of Christianity look like the only version, while pushing James and the original Jerusalem community off to the sidelines, or even erasing them altogether. So, how would you even do something like that? Well, the theory proposes a pretty simple three-step process for this historical overwrite. Step 1, elevate Paul's story, make him the main hero. Step 2, systematically downplay and obscure the importance of James as the real leader. And step 3, discredit the entire Jerusalem church, making them seem misguided or just not as important as Paul's mission. Let's look at a specific example of how this could have worked. Think about Peter. In the New Testament, he often comes across as this vacillating middleman, you know? He's always caught in the middle, swayed by both James and Paul. Well, Eisenman argues that's no accident. That portrayal was supposedly designed to weaken the authority of the entire Jerusalem leadership that Peter was a part of. So the crucial point, the big takeaway from all this, is that Eisenman's theory argues the beginning of Christianity wasn't about unity at all. It was about a fundamental schism, a deep, defining conflict between a Jewish national resistance movement on one side and a brand new, universal, pro-Roman religion on the other. In the end, whether you buy this particular theory or not, it really forces us to ask a tough question about, well, all of history. If it really is written by the victors, then what other stories, what other conflicts, what other entire points of view have been buried under the official narratives we've always just taken for granted?